Welcome to On the Other Hand, and a special welcome to Abyssalo and any other new viewers to this episode of Divisive Definitions. So if you've been following US politics over the past several months, you've probably heard the term mostly peaceful protests thrown around a lot. This term has been debated within the BLM context, but recently, a study came out that said that 93% of protests have been peaceful. I didn't give this study much thought until I had some downtime and looked into it. My conclusion? The study is biased, very biased, and I wanted to share some highlights. So, let's dive right in. Here's a list of the highest cited sources in this study. But just because some of these sources are biased doesn't necessarily mean that the data isn't correct. I mean, look at me, I'm fairly biased, and I'm always right. And here's the all sides graphic showing prominent news sources and their biases, and I've highlighted the ones this study references. You might notice the sources are grouped, and on the left side. Again, that's not saying that automatically means anything in the study is wrong, but the bias in sources did set off some red flags in my head. Getting into the actual text, after an overview of COVID and Floyd, we got this statement. In many local communities, protests marking Floyd's death have doubled as acts of remembrance for people like Micheal Brown, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, and Trayvon Martin. Can we pause and note that Micheal Brown was the first on their list? If you didn't know, Micheal Brown assaulted an officer, tried to take his gun, and got shot and killed by the officer who was acting in self-defense. There were conflicting stories following Brown's death, however, and the Ferguson riots happened because people believed what turned out to be a false narrative. It just doesn't sit well with me to list tragedies and victims next to someone who was clearly in the wrong. Anyway, then the study mentions these cases. Even amid the current round of demonstrations, new cases have been added to the list, from Rashard Brooks, an unarmed black man killed by police in Atlanta, Georgia, to Jacob Blake, an unarmed black man shot 7 times by police in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Okay, the death of Rashard Brooks was a tragedy, but he did overpower 2 officers and took a taser off one of them and tried to use it on the officers. Jacob Blake also fought with officers, even put one in a headlock, and it still is to be seen if he had a knife on him the whole time or if he was reaching for a knife in the car. However, to label both of these incidents simply as unarmed black men being killed is disingenuous at best. After that section, we get to the meat of the study, and it states the protests are an overwhelmingly peaceful movement, and that, in more than 93% of all demonstrations connected to the movement, demonstrators have not engaged in violence or destructive activity. Peaceful protests are reported in over 2,400 distinct locations around the country. Violent demonstrations, meanwhile, have been limited to fewer than 220 locations, under 10% of the areas that experience peaceful protests. Yet, despite data indicating that demonstrations associated with the BLM movement are overwhelmingly peaceful, one recent poll suggested that 42% of respondents believe that most protests associated with the BLM movement are trying to incite violence or destroy property. Research from the University of Washington indicates that this disparity stems from political orientation and biased media framing. I find it interesting that they acknowledge that biased media framing is happening, but only seem to indicate it is happening to vilify protesters. The study then moves on to police involvement during protests as follows. Despite the fact that demonstrations associated with the BLM movement have been overwhelmingly peaceful, more than 9%, or nearly 1 in 10, have been met with government intervention, compared to 3% of all other demonstrations. I wish they would have broken down how this 9% of government intervention overlaps with the 9% of riots they cited earlier, because to me, it only makes sense that police intervention closely matches rioting. Then the study says this. In July 2019, authorities intervened in under 2% of all demonstrations, fewer than 30 events, relative to July 2020, when they intervened in 9% of all demonstrations, or over 170 events. Authorities have used force, such as the firing less lethal weapons like tear gas, rubber bullets, and pepper spray, or beating demonstrators with batons, in over 54% of the demonstrations in which they have engaged. This, too, is a significant increase relative to 1 year ago. So as far as I understand, violent demonstrations, aka riots, made up 220 of total incidents, and police intervened in 170 total incidents. So, one could argue the police have actually been more peaceful than the overwhelmingly peaceful protests. Yet, this study frames government action as heavy-handed approach every time. An interesting choice, to say the least. Then the study goes into specific events, citing Lafayette Park as follows. Rhetoric soon translated into action. In early June, the government used National Guard troops, Secret Service agents, and the U.S. Park Police, among other federal agents, to violently disperse peaceful protests in Lafayette Square outside the White House to create a photo opportunity at St. John's Church. This is where I feel like the study could have benefited from looking at right-leaning news sources, because this source says that the clearing of protests wasn't done in coordination with Trump, and also that police said that violent protesters began throwing projectiles including bricks, frozen water bottles, and caustic liquids before officers dispersed the crowd. As with most stories, there are two sides to this event, and only listening to one side makes it hard to find the truth. The next event the study covers is the CHAZ or CHOP, where it said, while CHOP was marred by criminal violence, the creation of an encampment coincided with a lull in violent demonstrations. I feel like here they're playing word games. If you check the Wikipedia page for the CHAZ, it says it was an occupational protest, but the study shows a lull in violence despite 4 shootings happening in this occupation zone. I feel like they use semantics to brush over the violence that happened to paint the picture that they wanted to show. The cited Vox article itself says that, over the past 9 days, the area saw 4 shootings, 2 deaths, arson, and several alleged sexual assaults. According to the FBI data, there were 34 homicides reported in 2018 in all of Seattle. After talking about CHAZ, the study moves on to Portland, and it says this. Throughout June, demonstrators rallied outside the Multnomah County Justice Center and other prominent governance sites in downtown Portland, sporadically clashing with police who blanketed the city with tear gas and impact munitions. Against the wishes of local officials, federal authorities began aggressively policing the demonstrations, using excessive force and arbitrarily detaining suspected protesters in unmarked vehicles. So this is interesting to me. The entire section on Portland only mentions the actions of law enforcement, and never references what the demonstrators were doing. Here I'd like to just show a segment from one of the nights in Portland as filmed by Andy Ngo. Now call me crazy, but when talking about the aggressive policing and excessive force used by law enforcement, it might also be good to mention the actions of the rioters. Like rioters throwing commercial-grade fireworks at officers, rioters pointing lasers in the eyes of officers, or rioters attempting to burn down the courthouse. It's just another red flag that the study tends to frame the discussion on the police pouncing on rioters, not on the actions of both sides. Anyway, the Portland section is rounded out by this statement. Although federal authorities were purportedly deployed to keep the peace, the move appears to have re-escalated tensions. Prior to the deployment, over 83% of demonstrations in Oregon were nonviolent. Post-deployment, the percentage of violent demonstrations has risen from under 17% to over 42%, suggesting that the federal response has only aggravated unrest. In Portland, violent demonstrations rose from 53% to nearly 62% of all events after federal agents arrived on the scene. Okay, in a city and state known for police being told to stand down and not arrest protesters, is it a surprise when federal law enforcement is deployed and they actually enforce the law? When rioting is actively happening, can law enforcement stop rioters in any other way than meeting force for force? Violence might have risen shortly after federal troops were deployed, but once they actually started arresting people, Portland actually had some peace after 3 months of nightly riots. Anyway, I find the conclusion of the study to be pretty telling, and it reads as follows. With 2 months until the election, the U.S. faces deep divisions over racial inequality, the role of police, and economic hardship exacerbated by the ineffectual pandemic response. The administration has taken multiple steps to inflame these tensions, from announcing further federal deployments in Democrat-led cities, like Chicago and Albuquerque, to threatening a postponement of the election altogether. In this hyperpolarized environment, state forces are taking a more heavy-handed approach to dissent, non-state actors are becoming more active and assertive, and counter-demonstrators are looking to resolve their political disputes in the street. Without significant mitigation efforts, these risks will continue to intensify in a lead-up to the vote, threatening to boil over in November if the election results are delayed, inconclusive, or rejected as fraudulent. Now, it could just be me, but for all the data and sources this study had, it's very interesting that the conclusion doesn't focus on the facts, but on the author's thoughts on the state of the country. So given this study, where does one draw the line between peaceful protests and riots? For a spouse, any level of violence is unacceptable, but for something like driving a car, a small possibility of injury and death is seen as an acceptable trade-off for the transportation. So the question is, do you think 93% is overwhelmingly peaceful, or is 7% unacceptably violent? I think this study had some interesting data, and I appreciate having it, but considering the red flags I saw in this study, I don't think the term mostly peaceful protests applies nearly as often as used. As always, thanks, hope you enjoyed. And if you did, consider subscribing and hitting the bell so you'll be notified for new uploads.